Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 221. This is our class for Wednesday, the 3rd of February, where we are beginning to actually talk about some of Shakespeare's texts in terms of his sonnets. And I wanted to begin by talking a little bit about Renaissance language. And as we've discussed before, there wasn't much in the way of standardization during Shakespeare's time. There were multiple ways to spell words, for instance, and one of the jobs of modern editors is to try to apply some rules of standardization to the language itself. Some of the language was created at the time and was never used again, and some words were created and have been incorporated into our current language. Some words had different meanings at the time of the Renaissance as compared to contemporary times. Take a word like die, for instance, D-I-E, which in contemporary times would mean the ending of life, but during Shakespeare's time, it could also mean orgasm. So there was a lot of possibility for punning and double entendres in Shakespeare's plays if he used the word die. For instance, I die upon your lap. That there would be a double meaning there. One would be a sexual meaning, and one would be a more literal meaning. And in fact, during the time of the Renaissance, they were fairly liberal in terms of sex and violence. It was politics and religion that they needed to exercise particular caution with, which we will also talk about in the next few minutes. But I wanted to talk about, in terms of Renaissance language, how even pronunciation was different at the time. And there's a video, approximately 10 minutes or so, that I'd like you to watch that talks a little bit about the original pronunciation of Shakespearean language as compared to the modern day pronunciation. And this video actually was shot in the reconstructed Globe Theater that I was talking about earlier. That was a project done by Sam Wanamaker, the American actor. So we will watch a performance, A Midsummer Night's Dream, actually done in that globe, but you can get some nice shots of the globe. So do watch that video. I suggest that what you might want to do is stop my video now and then watch the video, though you can always watch the video after the fact. There's an additional video also that I would like you to watch, and it's entitled, well, I won't tell you what it's entitled. Let's just say it's illustration of the difference between our contemporary language and Renaissance language. I hope you find it to be somewhat amusing. And it illustrates the point that once you understand the plot, then you can really begin to appreciate the language. And I know that Shakespearean language can be very intimidating, and I do encourage you to remember that even some of the scholars debate the particular meaning of a word. So you don't necessarily have to read a Shakespearean play and translate each and every word. What you want to do is get a holistic sense of it. And in terms of reading Renaissance English, I thought that we could begin with Shakespeare's sonnets and talk a little bit about those, and before we actually get into something that's much longer. And the sonnet structure is probably one of the more interesting things about the sonnets because it's quite rigid. But that said, Shakespeare was able to show a good amount of creativity and originality within them. We have 154 sonnets, and I believe I had mentioned in an earlier video that the belief is that most of these, if not all of these sonnets, were written when the theater houses were closed for plague. And sonnets, a Shakespearean or Renaissance sonnet, as they're called, are 14-line poems. They don't have any titles, so they are referred to by their first line. Scholars have also put the sonnets together in a particular numerical order, so you can refer to the sonnet by its number. What we've got in a sonnet is a 10-syllable line. And there is an example of this in the notes below in the video with perhaps one of the most famous sonnet lines. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Or if you were to read this in terms of the syllables, you'll see it's shall I compare thee to a summer's day. So we've got the 10-syllable line. We also have a particular rhyme scheme or pattern of rhyme. And the way that you determine a rhyme is that you look at the last word of each line. And the letters of the alphabet are used in order to indicate a rhyme. So the letter A, for instance, would be the first rhyme that you encounter in a poem, and basically that would be the last word of the first line. And then when you have another word ending a line that does not rhyme with the initial rhyme, you go to the second letter of the alphabet, B, and so on and so forth. So then you can determine a pattern. And the pattern we're going to find in all of Shakespeare's sonnets happens to be A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. So basically what we've got is every other line rhyming with itself, and then the last two lines form what's known as a couplet. In other words, those two lines rhyme with one another, and those two lines almost serve like a conclusion in an academic paper, if you will, and that it serves to kind of tie up things and give a summary of everything. And the sonnets had to address themes that were considered to be appropriate for a poem, so they had to be serious and lofty. Scholars have divided up the sonnets into two major groups, the early sonnets and the later sonnets. The early sonnets are thought to have been written to a young man. Lots of speculation as to who that might be. Probably it was Shakespeare's patron. The importance of having a patron at the time cannot be understated because of not only the financial support that a patron could provide, but the political support that a patron could provide. Again, theater was seen as somewhat unsavory during the time, and especially somebody like Shakespeare who used theater as a way to make social and political and religious commentary, he could oftentimes get himself into a bit of trouble. So having a strong patron would be important. Many of the sonnets are very flattering in nature, and it makes a lot of sense that Shakespeare would want to flatter his particular patron. But there's been speculation about the patron, and in fact, there is as much speculation about the sonnets and whom they were written to as there is about Shakespeare's life. And many times individuals will try to read the sonnets to try to get a sense more of Shakespeare's biography. But that won't get you very far because the sonnets tend to talk about so many different issues that it really is hard to pinpoint any specific biographical information within the sonnets themselves. The latter set of sonnets are thought to have been written to a woman known as the Dark Lady because of her dark features. Not necessarily her complexion, but her eyes and her hair. Keep this in mind when we read Midsummer Night's Dream and we start talking about Hermia with her dark hair and her dark eyes. The speculation is that this dark lady was either someone that Shakespeare admired or someone that Shakespeare was having an active affair with. After all, he had left his home, Stratford upon Avon, and had gone to London for the theater. I guess a comparable example might be leaving Greenfield to go to Boston. And the idea of Shakespeare being alone all of that time has certainly led to all kinds of speculation about possible partners, both male and female. And in the end, as we know, there is very little evidence for anything in relation to Shakespeare, but we do know that there are a good number of sonnets that are written to this dark lady, this woman with dark hair and dark eyes, and they are complementary in nature. In terms of reading the sonnets, how I recommend you proceed is reading them out loud because you can hear the musicality within the poems themselves. Poems are basically much like songs. If you listen to song lyrics, many song lyrics, well, some song lyrics, are quite poetic in nature and in fact could even be thought of as poetry. Now with poetry we don't have obviously the background instruments so that we can identify a beat, but poetry utilizes the sounds of the words themselves, almost like rap music does, without the instrumentation, and in order to make a certain level of meter or beat. And if you read the sonnets out loud, you can oftentimes identify that, or you can listen to somebody else who's reading them out loud. And there are lots of possibilities here, but I do recommend one in particular. It's an interesting story how this came about. The sonnets have all been read out loud and are posted on YouTube by Sir Patrick Stewart. If you know anything about Sir Patrick Stewart, he's an actor, probably gained his fame by playing Captain Picard in Star Trek The Next Generation. But he's a classically trained actor and a Shakespearean actor and very skilled at what he does. In the early days of the pandemic, he underwent an experiment of trying to read as many sonnets as possible, a sonnet a day, in order to cheer us all up, so to speak, when we were dealing with all of these unknowns. There are 154 sonnets, and sadly, this pandemic has been much longer than 154 days. So, around August or so, he ran out of sonnets. And hopefully, we are nearing the ending days of this pandemic. But you can listen to all of the sonnets if you so wanted to, or at least the sonnets which I assigned for class. And I specifically assigned 3 sonnets from the early set and 3 sonnets from the later set so that we could get a sense of the sonnets that might have been written to that young man who could be a patron, and then those sonnets who might have been written to the dark lady who is someone that Shakespeare admired or perhaps had some physical attraction to, and someone he perhaps even had an active affair with. And sonnets 15, 18, and 20 are the sonnets that we are going to be reading to illustrate the earlier set of sonnets. And sonnet 127, 130, and 151, those are the sonnets that we are going to be reading to illustrate the later sets of sonnets. Once you've listened to a particular sonnet, try to paraphrase it in your own contemporary English, so that you can get a sense of its plot, if you will. But that's only the surface level reading. You want to reread, and definitely with poetry, it's particularly important to engage in rereading because it is so compact and so dense. And after you've reread the poem or the sonnet, and I usually recommend 3 readings: the first in order to understand the content, the second to begin your analysis, and then the third to refresh your memory before you begin to talk about it in class. Though I understand that that might not always be practical, particularly when it comes to reading the plays because they're rather lengthy. But that would be ideal, and certainly the more times that you reread, the more likely you are to uncover new analysis. In terms of identifying themes, we will see as we read these sonnets that many of the issues or themes that are talked about in the sonnets are issues and themes that we will find in the plays themselves. So, in some ways, the sonnets are a good way to prepare us for what Shakespeare will be writing about in his dramas. Then you can begin to look at the sonnets for the specific language and its use of language. So things like imagery or symbolism or metaphor. Now, symbols are representational, so it's an object that represents something else. A metaphor is comparing two dissimilar things without the use of like or as. When you use like or as, well, that happens to be a simile rather than a metaphor. Things like rhyme, which I was just talking about earlier, the endings of the words having similar sounds. Or alliteration, which is somewhat similar to rhyme, but this is the beginnings of words, the initial consonant sounds having the same sound. Now, I thought I would start with Sonnet 15 and talk a little bit about that particular sonnet in depth. And then we could continue on next class with the other sonnets, because again, I do want you to watch the video about original pronunciation versus modern pronunciation. And I also wanted you to watch about contemporary language as opposed to Renaissance language. And in fact, today's attendance question is going to be based on the idea of pronunciation, where I'm going to be asking you for your perspective on pronunciation. Do you prefer original pronunciation, which is known as OP, or modern pronunciation, MP, at least based on the examples in that video, and why? And that would be due on Thursday, the 4th at 8 a.m. Obviously, there's no right or wrong answer to this question. That's very deliberate so that we can have a dialogue. Again, I encourage you to read all of the responses of your peers as well as my responses as well, because that will help to simulate a class discussion. And if anything happens to be of interest to you, certainly you can respond much like you would respond in a classroom. But the first sonnet that I had assigned for us was Sonnet 15. And I wanted to read this to you out loud. I'm obviously not going to be able to do nearly as good of a job as Sir Patrick Stewart, but I'll try my best. And Sonnet 15 is, when I consider everything that grows, holds in perfection but a little moment, that this huge stage presenteth naught but shows, whereon the stars in secret influence comment. When I perceive that man as plants increase, cheered and checked even by the selfsame sky, vaunt in their youthful sap, at height decrease, and wear their brave state out of memory. Then the conceit of this inconstant stay sets you most rich in youth before my sight, where wasteful time debateth with decay, to change your day of youth to sullied night. And all in war with time for love of you, as he takes from you, I engraft you new. Again, I recommend that you read the sonnet several times, and you can see that in the notes below, I've indicated some of the things that you might want to consider in terms of this particular sonnet. First, note the use of I and you. This is a very personal sonnet that is written by the poet, but the you is not indicative of a particular gender. And I think it's one of the reasons why Shakespearean sonnets tend to be so popular, is that many of the sonnets can be applied to different genders in different situations. That's not necessarily the case with all of them. Some of them are very specifically written to a particular person, such as the Dark Lady, as I was referencing. But this one is a rather general one. Shakespeare oftentimes uses vegetation imagery, which is something that we see in Sonnet 15 as well. That the natural world is very much a reflection of the human world and vice versa. What we also see in this particular sonnet is the reference to the stage. And this is known as metadrama, where you are drawing a direct reference to the idea of us watching something on a stage, or Shakespeare being a playwright. And he oftentimes does things like this. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, we will see the play within a play as a very conscious way of sort of drawing our attention to the fact that we are watching a play. The theme of aging is one that we oftentimes see in the sonnets and what occurs during aging, and the inconstant nature of things. In other words, that things are always subject to change. We see personification in this particular sonnet. For instance, the words time and decay are capitalized. Personification is giving human qualities to inanimate objects. So in other words, time and decay are presented as enemies, opponents. And this sense of engrafting, which we have in the poem, is a nice way to talk about how poetry can renew and immortalize, but it also is in reference to what one does with plants. And again, lots of that growth vegetative imagery that we will see in the plays itself. And it's very common for Shakespeare to talk about gardening and even present us with gardeners, as we will see in Richard II. And this sense of the power of the poet to immortalize through verse, this is considered to be quite subversive at the time. And again, I wanted to read the poem to you. When I, so again, the poet is talking about himself, consider everything that grows. So again, he's talking about the natural world. Holds in perfection but a little moment. In other words, things continue to age and we lose that moment of perfection. That this huge stage presenteth naught but shows. That's the metadrama reference to this huge stage. He's making a comparison to the world being much like a huge stage, wherein the stars in secret influence comment. So now he's talking about the universe itself. When I perceive that men as plants increase, in other words, men, like plants, grow in age, cheered and checked even by the selfsame sky, and that reference to the sky and the stars gives the sense of cosmology, vaunts in their youthful sap, at height decrease, in that there is a kind of pyramid structure to the life cycle, and that you reach a point, the high point of the pyramid, and that's perfection, and then there's descent and aging. And wear their brave state out of memory. And the idea of one being forgotten is something that Shakespeare oftentimes talks about within his own writing, that is, that writing can preserve an individual's memory. that the conceit of this inconstant stay, again, this sense of change that continually occurs, sets you most rich in youth before my sight. That for the creator of this poem, they're always going to think of the subject of this poem as being youthful and at the height of their life. Where wasteful time debateth with decay. And we see time and decay, again, capitalized. So these are the two enemies to youth, time and decay. Notice that debateth and decay both start with D's. That would be an example of alliteration, where you've got two words that are starting with the initial consonant sound. To change your day of youth to sullied night. And oftentimes the time of the day is used as a reference to what could be considered a stage in life. Seasons are oftentimes used as well. So morning would represent perhaps youth or birth. And then afternoon would represent adulthood, let's say. And then evening would be the beginning of old age. And then finally nighttime would be death. And we see this oftentimes as well with the seasons, where spring would be birth, summer would be the height of life, fall would be the beginning of descent, and winter would be old age and death. So he talks about to change your day of youth, so youth is connected with day in this instance, to sullied night. And night would be representational of the decay that occurs with time. In other words, aging. And then the last two lines that serve as a kind of summary, a punch, if you will. And all in war with time for love of you. As he takes from you, I engraft you new. In other words, everything that time takes from the subject of this poem, the subject's youth and beauty, I, the poet, engraft you new. In other words, by implanting through the verse, I can make you into something better. Think about how arrogant that is, because the idea of being able to preserve or to immortalize is usually something that's reserved for God. What Shakespeare is saying is that this is something that also is reserved for authors, particularly Shakespeare. So this is the height of arrogance in some respects. And he was right, because here we are in 2021 still talking about the subject of this. But how might this be considered that subversive? It's because of the established order and the way that society was viewed at the time. There was something called the chain of being, which served as a kind of hierarchy or ranking of all living things in the universe. And all the way at the top of the chain of being would be God. And then the angels would come next. And the angels themselves would be ranked. Everything was ranked based on its ability to reason. And then ultimately would come humanity. And then within humanity, there would also be rankings. And the rankings aren't too surprising in that the rich would be ranked above the poor, men would be ranked above women, adults would be ranked above children, so forth and so on. These are very strict rules that dictated things such as the clothing one wore, the fabrics one was allowed to wear, even the colors one was allowed to wear, or where one sat at a dinner table or at a church pew, for instance. And then the rankings continued on into the animal world, almost basically as a way of sort of illustrating that some animals had a superiority to others. So if you think about the difference between a squirrel, for instance, and the squirrels were considered to be, let's say, lower orders, and they would be hunted by the lower levels of society, as compared to deer, which would be considered higher up on the chain of being, and those would be hunted by the higher elements in the chain of being. Basically, one was born into one's position in the chain of being, and you really couldn't change that. So at the very top of humanity would be the king and the queen, and they would be considered to be God anointed, God's mouthpiece, if you will, on earth. So basically, when Shakespeare is stating something like a poet, and particularly Shakespeare can immortalize through verse, Shakespeare has just moved himself up the chain of being to be right next to God. And that's why it would be considered to be so subversive. Also, because Shakespeare questioned, at least not necessarily overtly, but at least covertly, the established order. And would it be possible to move up or down that chain of being based on things like education and also based on behavior and temperament? So someone could move up the chain of being, but someone could also move down the chain of being. And we'll oftentimes see this illustrated in the kind of language that they use in Shakespeare's plays. The poetry is supposed to be reserved for the higher levels of order in the chain of being: kings, queens, nobilities, things of that sort. And then the non poetry, the language that we ourselves speak, prose, would be considered for the lower orders. But oftentimes the lower orders would be speaking in poetry. Perhaps Shakespeare's way of illustrating that the lower orders perhaps were not as base as one would think based on their placement in the chain of being, that actually they have a lot more intellect and refinement. And in fact, they've actually moved themselves up on the chain of being. And we can see the opposite, where a character high up on the chain of being, perhaps a king, is initially speaking in verse or in poetry and eventually descends into prose or complete sentences. So the language illustrates the actual descent of that particular person's morality. So when we think about Shakespeare, there were standards at the time, and even with standards of beauty, and that Shakespeare would defy. The Dark Lady would be a way that he would defy the standards of beauty, because fair and was considered to be superior to dark. But we'll see that standard also questioned in something like A Midsummer Night's Dream. And there was a censor at the time, a master of revels, who again wouldn't necessarily be censoring a play because of sex or violence, but could censor a play because of things like politics or religion. So, in other words, if Shakespeare was going to make commentary, he needed to do it in a clever way so that the master of revels would basically not stop him from doing that. Now, Sonnet 18, which is the next sonnet that I assigned for us to read, the Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, is probably Shakespeare's most famous sonnet, and dare I say that it's probably the most commonly misread poem in literature. And it's because of the misunderstanding about the word thee. Thee means you. So, in other words, there isn't a specific denotation of gender. And more often than not, what you hear with this poem is that this poem was written to a woman. There is no evidence this poem was written to a woman. This poem was written to a person. And since this poem has been grouped by scholars in the early sets of poems, it's thought that this poem is written to a young man, the Earl of Southampton, perhaps, or as Shakespeare's patron, or perhaps someone else. So, as you are reading Sonnet 18, which oftentimes is cited as perhaps one of the most romantic poems ever written, and in fact, it's even become cliche by this point, think about the fact that it may not necessarily be romance in terms of sexual union, but more in terms of a poem of flattery, which is the way that it's usually read. But of course, as you know with Shakespeare, there are people who want their conspiracy theories, and they will turn to Sonnet 18 and say, well, this is evidence that Shakespeare was a homosexual. And actually, Christopher Marlowe, a name that you probably remember from our last class, was a known homosexual. So could that be yet another piece of evidence? And again, I say that if you read this poem, I think you'll see that it doesn't really have to do with sex. There are Shakespearean poems that have to do with sex, and we are going to be reading a couple of them, and it will be pretty obvious. But this isn't one of them. So basically, what we're going to be doing next class is finishing up with all of these sonnets. We'll begin with Sonnet 18. I wanted to discuss the journals as well, because your first journal will be due next week. That happens to be on the 10th of February, where I'm asking you to write about a page or so in response to the sonnets. And you can make a decision to talk about all of the sonnets in their entirety, or you can make a decision to focus on one sonnet in depth, or you could take some sort of a middle ground and choose 2 or 3 sonnets and talk a little bit about your thoughts and your reflections. Again, I'm not looking for anything in particular in relation to the journals, and I'm not evaluating for grammar or mechanics. I kind of see it as a conversation on paper, and I evaluate it on a checkmark system. And then after the sonnets, when we start moving to the plays, you will be submitting in journals for each of the plays after we are done discussing those plays. So you could certainly utilize anything that I've talked about in my class videos or any conversations that have occurred in the attendance form, or also again remember that I have an optional chat room, and I also have an optional Zoom on Mondays and Wednesdays at 1 that you can pop into, and we can talk, or and if several people are there we can have a class discussion as well. So again, as I had indicated, it's ideal if you can have the play read in its entirety at the beginning of the unit in which we begin the play. And for us, our first class for A Midsummer Night's Dream is the 10th of February. I'm also a realist, and I realize that the 10th of February may not allow you enough time to read the play in its entirety. However, we will also be watching performances. Not that that's a substitution for reading the play, it's a supplement, but that will also give you a little bit of time to do some catching up. And my goal and hope is that while we are talking about Midsummer, you're reading the next play. And for us, that happens to be Much Ado About Nothing. So again, our attendance question on the class discussion forum, Thursday, the 4th, due at 8 a.m. Do you prefer OP, original pronunciation, or MP, modern pronunciation, and why? I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on talking about Shakespeare next class. Take care. Bye-bye.